Hi everybody, this is TheHande and welcome back to this ongoing series where I talk about Finland's leaders. And today it is the tragic or tragically hilarious story of Finland's first female prime minister. In case you haven't heard, Finland right now has a very young female prime minister, and provided that Sanna Marin is able to hold on to office until the end of her term, she will most likely become Finland's longest-serving female prime minister. A common problem with Finnish prime ministers during this millennium is that literally none of them have served their full terms, and even the prime ministers that have served the longest terms have usually ended up leaving office about roughly a year before their term was up. Sanna Marin is also our second female prime minister who was technically not elected into her position, but rather she was picking up the reins after our freshly elected prime minister was forced to resign after holding the office for barely 6 months. But today I want to take you back to the early 2000s when Finland elected its first female prime minister, and in fact she remains the only female prime minister to actually get elected into office. So this is the story of the rise and fall of one Anneli Jäätteenmäki. Now a bit of context, Anneli Jäätteenmäki started her political career in the late 80s and early 90s. When she became prime minister, she was the head of the Centre Party, and at the point when she was elected in 2003, the Centre Party had just spent 8 long years in the opposition. During the early 90s, Finland had a centre-led government led by a certain Esko Aho, who, like Sanna Marin today, raised a lot of eyebrows because he was so young. What also happened in the early 90s was that Finland was hit by a huge recession caused by Finland's very slipshod financial policies during the 1980s. So while it wasn't technically the Centre Party's fault, the Centre Party ended up taking a lot of the fall for Finland's terrible financial situation in the early 90s. And this was a dire time. Nearly a quarter of the population was unemployed at the time. The Finnish mark was plummeting in value, banks were going out of business left and right, and the Soviet Union was collapsing, taking away Finland's #1 trading partner. It was during this chaotic period when Finland decided that it needed to join the European Union in order to attain some financial stability. And as I said, the Centre Party ended up taking a lot of the heat because none of their policies at the time seemed to be putting any kind of dent in the financial situation of the day. The Centre Party was so unpopular that during the 1995 elections, what ended up happening was that the big parties on the left and right, the SDP and the NCP, ended up forming a government together and immediately got to work in order to save Finland's financial situation. And by all accounts, they were fairly successful at it. So much so that they got themselves re-elected in 1999. Both of these governments were led by the SDP Prime Minister Paavo Lipponen. And as you can probably guess, Lipponen pretty much became the #1 enemy of the Centre Party during this time. Former Prime Minister Esko Aho continued to be the head of the Centre Party during the opposition years until in the early 2000s he moved to the United States in order to become a lecturer at Harvard University and handed the reins over to Anneli Jäätteenmäki. So the #1 thing I want to point out before we get to the actual election and then what ended up happening to Jäätteenmäki, I want to stress that she had mad political cred before she got elected. Not only had she been a very vocal opponent of Paavo Lipponen, she'd actually served as a minister in Esko Aho's government, and once Aho left, Jäätteenmäki became the only female leader of the big 3 parties in Finland. So I want to stress that all of this really was building up to the fact that many people saw her ascension to become Finland's first female prime minister inevitable, especially when in 2000 we already elected our first female president. So in that sense, it was not a surprise that Jäätteenmäki garnered such a huge following in the 2003 elections. Of course, there was the inevitable fact that Lipponen's government did start to lose some of its popularity during the second term. Paavo Lipponen himself started to become a target of a lot of criticisms due to his authoritarian way of heading the government. And then during the 2003 elections, Jäätteenmäki pulled a surprising ace from her sleeve when she began talking very loudly about the fact that while being prime minister and during an official state visit to the United States, Paavo Lipponen had apparently offered military aid to the US in the second Iraq War. Now, of course, Lipponen denied all of this, but it did raise a lot of eyebrows, because the average Finnish voter did not like the Iraq War, did not like George W. Bush, and certainly did not like anybody who would associate themselves with him. So with Lipponen under fire, Jäätteenmäki's ascension to prime ministership was solid. But Very soon after she took office, people began to wonder where Jäätteenmäki had gotten that little bit of information about Lipponen and his visit with George W. Bush. In fact, the authorities were knocking on her door pretty much from day one. It inevitably turned out that where Jäätteenmäki had gotten that information was from a classified government document. In fact, not just any classified document, a document with the highest possible level of classification because it had come from the presidential office. So this already raised two very disturbing facts. Number one, that Jäätteenmäki very obviously had a mole in the presidential office, who was later identified as well, but also that already before assuming office, Jäätteenmäki had basically blurted out state secrets to the public, and although they might do things a little differently in your neck of the woods, generally that is considered extremely illegal. Now, Jäätteenmäki did play coy for a little while and tried to play it off like this was not a big deal, but it turns out she did not hide her trail very well because the authorities very quickly then discovered, and by the way, this betrays just how old school this scandal was, that those classified documents had been sent to her by fax, which is why this is sometimes referred to as the Jäätteenmäki fax scandal. When this little tidbit about the faxing finally came to light, Jäätteenmäki's go-to excuse became that she insists that the documents came to her without asking and as a complete surprise, which, as you can probably guess, ended up becoming a very popular punchline relating to her in the following years. Inevitably, as this all was going down, her own government started to get very embarrassed for her, and she was essentially forced to resign, having held the office for barely 3 months, becoming one of Finland's shortest-served prime ministers ever, which also forced her then to hand over the reins to Matti Vanhanen, who carried out as prime minister for the rest of her term, and to his own credit was actually elected for a second term, from which he inevitably resigned with barely a year left, and was replaced in office by our second female prime minister. So whatever happened to Jäätteenmäki after the scandal? Well, she got off surprisingly easy. Of course, she was prosecuted. But surprisingly, this did not kill off her political career. She's run for the Finnish parliament, she's become a Europarliamentarian. She has obviously not tried to regain control of the Centre Party, and has never made another bid for the prime ministership because her reputation was definitely soiled by this incident. So there you have it, the tragic or tragically hilarious story of Finland's first female prime minister. I'm TheHande, see you on the next one.